was bleeding under silk and diamonds, trying to survive the most expensive night of the year when the room started to spin. My back was a roadmap of scars I'd spent months hiding, but as the orchestra played, the pain finally became too loud to ignore. I reached for a champagne flute just to keep my hands from shaking, whispering to myself, "Don't fall. Not here, not in front of them." But the world went dark anyway. I expected to hit the cold marble in the ballroom floor, to be the subject of tomorrow's scandal. Instead, I was caught by arms like iron. Dario Valenti, the man they call the Shadow of the North, the Mafia boss who makes kings tremble, held me against his chest as if I were made of glass. And when he felt the heat of the wounds through my dress, the air in the room turned lethal. What Dario did next didn't just stop the gala, it changed my entire life. I went from a woman running for her life to being the obsession of the most dangerous man in the city. Before I tell you how he hunted down the man who hurt me, I need your help. We are so close to our subscriber goal, and your support means the world. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, have you ever had someone protect you when you were at your weakest? Now, let me take you back to the moment the music stopped. I knew I was in trouble the second I walked into that gala. Every step was a sharp reminder of what my ex had done to me 3 days ago in that dark hallway. I gripped my clutch until my knuckles were white, trying to blend into the shadows, never realizing that the biggest shadow in the room had already fixed his eyes on me. The music didn't just stop. It died a jagged death as the conductor's baton frozen in midair. A heavy, suffocating silence swept through the ballroom, punctuated only by the soft rustle of silk as hundreds of guests turned to witness the impossible. Dario Valenti, a man who moved for no one, was now the center of a frozen universe, his powerful frame shielding me from the prying eyes of the city's elite. "Turn off the cameras." Dario's voice didn't rise, but it carried a sub-zero chill that vibrated through my very bones. It wasn't a request, it was an edict. The frantic clicking of the paparazzi at the edge of the floor ceased instantly. Men who held millions in their bank accounts took instinctive steps back, clearing a path as if Moses himself were parting a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. I tried to protest, to tell him I could walk, but my voice was a thin, reedy thing that dissolved before it hit the air. My head lolled against his shoulder, my cheek resting against the cool, expensive cotton of his shirt. Beneath the fabric, I could feel the rhythmic, steady beat of his heart, unfazed, dominant, and terrifyingly calm. "Dario, please, the gala," I managed to whisper, my eyes fluttering as the chandeliers above blurred into long streaks of gold. "The gala is over, Leora," he countered, his grip tightening just enough to let me know I wasn't going anywhere. "The only thing that matters right now is why you're burning up in my arms and why you're bleeding through this dress." His strides were long and purposeful, cutting through the stunned crowd toward the grand exit. I saw the blurred faces of people I had known for years, people who had ignored the shadows under my eyes and the way I flinched at loud noises, looking on in a mix of horror and awe. Dario didn't give them a single glance. His focus was a singular burning point centered entirely on me. As we reached the towering oak doors, his lead security detail flanked us, forming a human wall of black suits and stone-cold expressions. The cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating perfume of the ballroom, but I barely had a moment to breathe it in before I was being settled into the plush leather interior of a waiting SUV. Dario didn't hand me off to a medic or a subordinate. He climbed in right behind me, pulling me back into the sanctuary of his lap as the door slammed shut with a finality that signaled the end of my old life. The engine roared to life, and as we sped away from the flashing lights of the gala, I looked up at the hard line of his jaw. He was no longer just the man I feared. He was the man who had just declared war on whoever had touched me. And for the first time in 3 days, I didn't feel like I had to hold myself together anymore. I let the darkness take me, knowing that for better or worse, I was finally behind the Valenti line. The silence of the elevator ride to the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the hum of machinery and the ragged sound of my own breath. Dario didn't put me down, not even when the doors slid open to reveal a sprawling expanse of glass, steel, and shadow. The city lights twinkled like distant jewels outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that felt like an approaching storm. He carried me straight to a master suite that smelled of rain and expensive cologne, laying me gently atop a dark silk sheets that felt like cool water against my feverish skin. "The doctor is 10 minutes out," Dario said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground me. He was hovering over me, his tailored vest discarded and his white sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the intricate ink that climbed his forearms. "But I need to see. I need to know what I'm dealing with, Leora." I shivered, the chill of the room clashing with the fire burning in my muscles. I reached back, my fingers fumbling uselessly at the hidden zipper of my gala gown. My movements were clumsy, blocked by the sharp, stabbing pain in my ribs and the stiffness of my spine. Without a word, Dario moved my hands away. His touch was surprisingly light, calloused and large, yet infinitely careful. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his weight dipping the bed, and slowly turned me onto my side. I gripped the silk pillowcase, my knuckles turning white as I felt the cool air hit my skin. The sound of the zipper descending was loud in the quiet room, a slow, rhythmic hiss that felt like the stripping away of my last defense. "Steady," he murmured, his breath warm against the nape of my neck. As the fabric fell away, revealing the silk slip beneath and the bruised, battered skin of my back, I felt him go completely still. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the sudden, violent shift in his energy. The controlled fury I had sensed earlier was no longer controlled. It was a living thing, dark and predatory, filling every corner of the suite. His hand hovered just inches above the jagged purple and blue marks that marred my skin, scars from a man who thought I was something he could break. "Who did this?" Dario's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural, terrifying sound that promised a reckoning. He wasn't just a man looking at a woman anymore. He was a king looking at a desecrated part of his kingdom. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping, as I realized that the secret I had nearly died to protect was now the fuel for a fire that would likely burn the city to the ground. The air in the room didn't just grow cold, it became heavy, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the sheer force of the silence. I remained frozen on my side, my skin prickling where the cool air met the angry heat of my wounds. I couldn't see Dario's face, but I felt the bed shift as he stood up. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed against my lungs. I waited for him to speak, to ask a question, to express pity, but when he finally moved, the sound was far more terrifying. It was the sound of a predator preparing for a kill. I heard the sharp metallic click of his watch being placed on the marble nightstand, followed by the slow, deliberate rolling of his sleeves further up his tattooed forearms. 3 days, he said, his voice so low it was barely a whisper, yet it carried the resonance of a death knell. "You've been walking among those vultures for 3 days with these marks on your soul." I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of him in the dim light of the penthouse. His jaw was set so hard I thought bone might shatter, and the veins in his neck were thick cords of tension. This wasn't the concern of a gentleman. This was the controlled fury of a man who looked at my broken body and saw a declaration of war. He reached out, his thumb grazing the very edge of a deep purple and blue bruise on my shoulder blade. I flinched, not from pain, but from the raw volcanic intensity radiating off him. "I tried to hide it," I choked out, my voice breaking. "I didn't want anyone to see how weak I was." Dario leaned down, his face inches from mine. His eyes weren't just dark, they were voids of absolute, terrifying promise. "There is no weakness in surviving a monster, Leora. The only weakness in this room belongs to the man who thought he could touch you and live to see another sunrise." He stood tall, pulling his phone from his pocket with a mechanical precision that made my blood run cold. He didn't look at the screen as he dialed. His gaze remained fixed on the scars on my back, memorizing every insult to my flesh. "Nico," he said into the phone, his voice devoid of all emotion, a sign that the beast had fully taken over. "The gala is over. Find out who Leora Santini has been hiding from. Check every camera, every call log, and every shadow in her life. When you find him, don't kill him, not yet. I want him to understand exactly whose territory he trespassed on." He hung up and looked back at me, the fire in his eyes promising a brand of safety that was as dangerous as it was absolute. I realized then that the man I had fainted into wasn't just saving my life, he was about to burn the world down to avenge it. The penthouse felt like a command center for a war I hadn't realized was starting. While I lay tucked beneath the heavy weight of the silk sheets, the quiet was replaced by the low, staccato rhythm of Dario's voice coming from the outer room. He paced like a caged panther, the golden light of the city catching the hard angles of his face as he moved past the glass. Through the cracked door, I watched him, the man who had carried me out of the gala, now directing a dark symphony of retribution. "I don't care about his connections," Dario growled into his phone, his voice a gravelly blade. "I don't care if he's a senator's son or a street-level king. He left marks on her. That makes him mine to dismantle." Outside, the city of Chicago began to tilt on its axis. Within the hour, the Valenti machine was fully awake. Black SUVs began to move through the streets like shadows detaching from the night. I could almost feel the tremors of his power radiating outward from this room. In the underworld, word was spreading with the speed of a forest fire. The boss had found someone to protect, and someone had been foolish enough to hurt her. Nico, Dario's most trusted enforcer, appeared in the doorway, his silhouette grim and unyielding. "The logistics are set, boss. We've frozen his accounts. We've squeezed his associates. He's running, but there's nowhere in this city that isn't Valenti territory." Dario didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the master bed, where I sat huddled, watching him with wide, weary eyes. The controlled fury hadn't abated. It had simply turned cold, crystalline, and infinitely more dangerous. He walked back into the room and sat on the edge of the mattress, the sheer gravity of his presence making the air feel thick. "The hunt is already over, Leora," he murmured, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind my ear. His hand was steady, but I could feel the coiled energy beneath his skin. He just doesn't know it yet. He thinks he's hiding in the dark, but he forgets. I am the dark. I shivered, not from cold, but from the realization that the man holding my hand was capable of horrors I couldn't imagine. Yet for the first time in months, the crushing weight of fear in my chest began to lift. The shadow hunt had begun, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the prey. I was the reason the predator was out for blood. As Dario's phone buzzed with a fresh update, a grim smirk touched his lips, the look of a man who had just cornered his prize. The city was trembling, and tonight it would learn exactly what happened when someone touched what belonged to Dario Valenti. The heavy, drug-like sleep of exhaustion finally began to peel away, leaving me adrift in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. For a moment, I panicked, my mind racing back to the cold marble of the gala floor and the suffocating fear of being found. I braced myself for the familiar searing pain in my back, expecting to wake up alone in the dark. But as my senses returned, I realized the air didn't smell like the hospital or the stale terror of my apartment. It smelled of expensive rain, vintage leather, and a deep, masculine warmth that felt like an anchor. I tried to shift, but I found myself held fast. A heavy, solid weight was draped across my waist, pinning me gently but unyieldingly to the mattress. I looked down to see a massive hand resting against my stomach, fingers blunt and powerful, the knuckles scarred from battles I could only imagine. Dario was behind me, his body a literal shield of muscle and heat pressed against my spine.
He wasn't just sleeping, he was guarding. Even in rest, he held me with iron bands of safety that made it impossible for the rest of the world to touch me.
I held my breath, afraid that moving would break the spell. For months, I had slept with one eye open, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. Now, encased in the arms of the city's most dangerous predator, I felt a peace that was almost frightening. I could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest against my back, a heartbeat that seemed to pulse with a silent promise. Mine. "You're awake," his voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through my ribs. It wasn't a question. He hadn't been fully asleep at all. I felt his grip tighten instinctively as I turned slightly to face him. His dark eyes were already open, searching mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. There was no softness in his gaze, only a primal, possessive clarity. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the lethal power in his frame. "I'm here, Leora," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "The doors are locked, my men are at every exit, and the man who did this to you is currently discovering that there are fates much worse than death." I let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for a lifetime, sinking back into the safety of his embrace. The world outside might be trembling, and the hunt might be turning the city red, but here, behind the velvet curtains of his world, I was no longer a victim. I was the one thing Dario Valenti had decided to keep, and as his arms locked around me once more, I knew I was never letting go. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse in time with the tension radiating from Dario's frame. He remained locked in place beside me, his presence a heavy, comforting weight that demanded the truth I had buried under layers of shame. The air was thick, charged with an electric current that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He didn't rush me, he simply waited, his dark eyes anchored to mine, offering a silent promise that whatever name I spoke would be the last word ever uttered by that man in this city. "He thinks he's untouchable," I whispered, my voice cracking as the memories threatened to drown me. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I was erased, that no one would even remember I existed. Dario's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached up, his large, tattooed hand cupping the side of my face with a gentleness that felt like a holy vow. "Leora, look at me. Look at where you are. You are in the heart of my world. No one erases what belongs to me." I took a shuddering breath, the scent of cedarwood cologne giving me a fleeting moment of courage. The name had been a poison in my blood for months, a secret that had been rotting me from the inside out. I looked into the eyes of the man the world feared and realized that my fear was finally meeting its match. It was Julian Vane. The name fell into the silence like a stone into a well. The shift was instantaneous. The air didn't just turn electric, it felt as though the atmospheric pressure in the room had dropped to absolute zero. Dario didn't flinch, didn't curse, and didn't move an inch, but the temperature of his gaze dropped to absolute zero. Julian Vane was a high-level financier, a man who moved in the same elite circles we had just fled. He was a man of prestige, of hidden darkness, and apparently a man who thought he could play with fire without getting burned. Dario's thumb traced the line of my lip, his expression becoming a mask of terrifying clarity. "Julian Vane," he repeated, the name sounding like a death sentence when spoken in his guttural baritone. "A man who built his life on numbers and reputations. He's about to learn that reputations are fragile and numbers can be reduced to zero." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine, and for a second the predator disappeared, replaced by something ancient and possessive. "Thank you for the name, Leora. Now close your eyes. From this second forward, Julian Vane no longer exists in your world. He only exists in mine. And in my world, there is no mercy for those who break what is precious." The first truth had been spoken, and as Dario stood up to reclaim his phone, I knew the city was about to witness a reckoning that would leave Julian Vane's legacy in ashes. The air remained charged, the storm finally breaking, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the lightning. I was the one who had brought it. The following morning, the sun didn't just rise, it illuminated a city that had been fundamentally reshaped overnight. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, wrapped in a plush silk robe that felt like a caress against my healing skin. Below, the streets of Chicago looked the same, but the digital ticker on the financial news was screaming a different story. Julian Vane's firm was in a freefall, his reputation dissolving in real time as scandals, meticulously unearthed and fed to the press by Dario's network, began to surface. But Dario wasn't satisfied with the digital execution. He wanted the world to see the change in my status. Leora, his voice rumbled from the doorway. I turned to see him dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than my apartment. His presence so dominant, it seemed to shrink the massive room. He walked toward me, his eyes tracking the way I moved, checking for any sign of pain. When he reached me, he didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside sat a heavy platinum cuff set with a singular, flawless black diamond. "This isn't just jewelry," he murmured, his fingers grazing my wrist as he snapped the lock into place. The weight of it was substantial, a physical reminder of the iron bands that now protected me. "It's a signal. In every room you walk into from this day forward, they will see this and they will know. You are under the Valenti crest. You are mine." He didn't stop there. By noon, the city's elite social circles were buzzing with a new development. Dario had bypassed the usual channels, sending his personal security detail to my old office to clear out my desk. It wasn't a quiet exit. It was a hostile takeover of my past. My former colleagues watched in stunned silence as men with cold eyes and bulges under their jackets reclaimed my belongings, informing the management that Leora Santini was now a senior partner in Valenti's private strategic firm. Later that afternoon, we stepped out onto the sidewalk of the most exclusive shopping district in the city. Dario didn't hide me in the back of the car. He walked beside me, his hand resting possessively at the small of my back, exactly where the scars were hidden. Every head turned. The whispers followed us like a wake. He was marking his territory in the most public way possible, showing the world that the fragile woman from the gala was now the most protected person in the city.
"They're looking," I whispered, leaning into his heat. "Let them look," Dario replied, his gaze sweeping the street with predatory warning. "I want them to see what happens when I decide something is precious. I want them to know that to touch you is to invite the end of their world." In that moment, the power shifted. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a queen being presented to her kingdom, shielded by a man who had turned the entire city into a cage for anyone who dared to look at me the wrong way. The air inside Dario's private office was different from the rest of the penthouse. It was cooler, smelling of old ink, expensive scotch, and the heavy metallic scent of power. I stood by the mahogany desk, watching as Dario stared at a series of monitors displaying the final collapse of Julian Vane's empire. The logic of my old life told me to stay quiet, to be grateful, and to keep my distance from a man who broke worlds for a living. But as I looked at the breadth of his shoulders and the way his tattooed hands gripped the edge of the desk, every logical defense I had built began to crumble. "He's gone, Leora," Dario said, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated in the small space between us. He didn't turn around. "Vane is being escorted to a location where he will answer for every mark he left on you. You're safe. You can go back to your life now, if that's what you want." The words felt like a test, or perhaps a final door being opened. Logic screamed at me to run, to take the safety he'd provided and disappear back into the anonymity of the city. But my feet wouldn't move. I looked at the black diamond cuff on my wrist, the symbol of the territory he had marked, and realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. What if I don't want my old life back? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but steady. Dario turned then, his eyes burning with a hunger that was barely contained. The controlled fury had transformed into something else, a reckless, starving desire that had been simmering since the moment he caught me at the gala. If you stay, Leora, there is no going back. I am not a good man. I am possessive, I am dangerous, and I will never let you go. Then don't, I challenged, stepping into his space until the heat from his body felt like a physical weight. The breaking point was instantaneous. Logic shattered as Dario's hand shot out, his fingers tangling in my hair to pull my head back, while his other arm locked around my waist, hoisting me against him. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of two people who had been circling a fire for too long. It was the surrender of the survivor to the protector, the victim to the queen. His touch was demanding, mapping the curves of my body as if he were memorizing his newest conquest. In the silence of the office, surrounded by the ruins of my enemies, I stopped fighting the inevitable. I didn't need a safe life. I needed his life. As he swept the items off the desk to pull me closer, I knew I had finally traded my fear for a passion that was just as dangerous and infinitely more beautiful. The move was not a transition. It was a surrender to a new reality. My old apartment, with its thin walls and the lingering scent of my own fear, was stripped of my belongings within a single afternoon. Dario's men moved with a silent, military precision, erasing the traces of the woman who had lived in the shadows. I stood on the balcony of the penthouse as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, bleeding shades of violet and deep gold over the city that now felt like it belonged to us. I was no longer the girl hiding bruises in a boardroom or a gala. I was dressed in a silk slip dress the color of midnight, the platinum cuff on my wrist catching the dying light. I heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of Dario's footsteps behind me before I felt the heat of his presence. He didn't say a word as he stepped up behind me, his massive hands resting on the railing, effectively caging me against his chest. "Everything you need is here, Leora," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle the very last of my nerves. "My home is yours. My men are yours. My name is yours." I leaned back into him, finding strength in the very shadow people spent their lives trying to avoid. For so long I had thought that being strong meant being alone, that independence was my only shield. But as I looked out over the sprawling city, I realized that true power was having the most dangerous man in the world kneel at your feet, so you never had to kneel again. The scars on my back were still there, but they no longer felt like marks of shame. They were the catalyst that had brought me to this heights. I turned in his arms, looking up into the dark, possessive depths of his eyes. There was no mercy in him for the world, but for me, there was a devotion that was absolute. "I'm not afraid anymore, Dario," I told him, my voice steady and clear. "Good," he replied, a grim, beautiful smirk touching his lips as he leaned down to claim my mouth one final time. "Because together, we're going to make sure this city is afraid of us." As the stars began to pierce the darkness, I finally understood my place. I wasn't just a survivor, and I wasn't just a guest in his penthouse. I was the new queen, standing firmly in the boss's shadow, knowing that while he ruled the streets with iron and blood, I was the only one who ruled him. My journey from the broken floor of a gala to the pinnacle of his empire was complete. I had found my sanctuary in the heart of the storm.